Mason Thibodeau's weathered hands trembled as he lit his last cigarette. The flame from his Zippo cast dancing shadows across the peeling wallpaper of his ramshackle cabin, momentarily illuminating the water stains that crept like dark veins across the ceiling. Outside, the bayou whispered its nightly secrets, a symphony of cicadas, the low moan of wind through cypress trees, and somewhere, too close for comfort, the splash of something heavy breaking the water's surface. He knew it was out there, waiting and watching. 3 weeks had passed since he'd first noticed the changes in his beloved swamp. The familiar sounds that had lulled him to sleep for 43 years had shifted, becoming wrong somehow. The bullfrogs had fallen silent. The gators had abandoned their favorite sunning spots. Even the nutria, those stubborn swamp rats that had plagued his garden for decades, had vanished. Mason took a long drag from his cigarette, holding the smoke in his lungs until it burned. The ember's glow reminded him of what he'd seen in the water that first night. 2 points of crimson light floating just above the surface, watching him from the darkness. He dismissed it then, blamed it on the half-empty bottle of bourbon that had kept him company after another solitary day of checking his crab traps. But the lights had returned the next day, and the next, each time closer to his dock. The old floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he crossed to the kitchen window. The moon hung low and bloated in the sky, its pale light filtering through the Spanish moss that draped the cypress trees like funeral shrouds. The air was thick with humidity, pressing against his skin like a damp cloth, and his t-shirt clung to his back, dark with sweat despite the relative cool of the October night. "Ain't nothing out there that wasn't there before," he muttered to himself, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. His mama had raised him on stories of the rougarou and other creatures that stalked the swamps, but he'd long since dismissed them as tales meant to keep children from wandering too far from his home. And now, at 56 years old, those stories crept back into his mind like kudzu, taking root into the fertile soil of his fear. The thing in the water had started leaving signs. First, it was just tracks. Strange, 3-toed impressions in the mud around his dock, too large to belong to any gator he'd ever seen. Then came the scratches on his boat, deep gouges in the metal that looked like they'd been made by claws harder than steel. And last week, he found the remains of a full-grown boar on his front porch, its body torn apart with surgical precision, organs arranged in a pattern that made his eyes hurt to look at. Mason's cigarette had burned down to the filter. He crushed it in the ashtray, already regretting that it was his last. The nearest store was Prejean's General, a good 5 miles up the dirt road, and he hadn't left his property since finding the boar. Something deep in his bones told him that's exactly what it wanted. To drive him out into the open, away from the relative safety of his cabin's walls. A splash, closer than before, made him flinch. The sound came from the direction of his dock, where his flat-bottomed boat rocked gently in the black water. He squinted through the window, trying to pierce the darkness that gathered thick as moss behind the cypress trees. There, 2 pinpricks of red light, hovering about 7 feet above the water's surface. They blinked slowly like a cat's eyes, but there was nothing feline about the way they moved. The lights swayed with an almost hypnotic rhythm, making his head spin when he tried to track their motion. "Nah, you ain't real," Mason whispered, pressing his forehead against the cool glass of the window. Nah, you ain't nothing but swamp gas and way too many years alone out here. The lights brightened in response, as if amused by his denial. A shape began to emerge from the darkness around them, a long, sinuous form that seemed to bend in ways that violated everything Mason knew about anatomy. The water around it began to churn, though there was no wind to disturb the surface. His hand reached for the shotgun he kept mounted above the sink, fingers closing around the familiar wooden stock. The weight of it should have been comforting, but Mason knew with the same certainty that told him when a storm was coming that buckshot would be useless against whatever waited for him outside. The radio on his counter crackled to life, making him jump. Static filled the kitchen, rising and falling like labored breathing. Through the white noise, he could almost make out words. Almost, but not quite. The volume increased steadily until he had to cover his ears, the static taking on a pitch that made his teeth ache. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the radio fell silent. In the ringing quiet that had followed, Mason heard something new, the slow, wet sound of footsteps on his dock. Thump, drag, thump, drag. Whatever was out there was heavy enough to make the old planks groan. Mason backed away from his window, his shotgun trained on the front door. The steps grew closer, accompanied by a sound like wet leather being stretched and torn. The porch steps now, 3 of them leading up to his door. The wood protested under the creature's weight, and Mason's back hit the far wall of his kitchen. Sweat ran into his eyes, but he didn't dare lower the gun to wipe it away. The motion-activated light on his porch flickered to life, and through the small window in his front door, Mason caught a glimpse of something that his mind refused to process. A mass of glistening flesh, folding and refolding upon itself like origami made from raw meat. Those red eyes blazed at the center of it all, and as he watched, the flesh began to unfold, revealing rows upon rows of teeth that spiraled inward like a twisted nautilus shell. Mason's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, every light in the cabin went out. The darkness that rushed in wasn't the normal darkness of a swamp night. It was absolute, primordial, the kind of darkness that existed before God said, "Let there be light." The front door creaked open. Mason screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. He fired blindly, the muzzle flash providing strobing snapshots of what was entering his home. Later, he would be grateful that his mind could only process fragments. A limb that bent backwards, skin that rippled like disturbed water, a mouth that opened to reveal another mouth, and then another, and then another. The shotgun clicked empty. In the silence that followed, Mason heard a sound like thousands of whispers overlapping, speaking words and languages that had died before humans walked the earth. The red eyes drew closer and closer, until they were all he could see. And then he saw everything. What Mason never told anyone, not even in his final moments when the thing with red eyes showed him visions of worlds beyond human comprehension, was that he'd seen signs of it long before that first night. Little things, easy to dismiss in the light of day. Like the way his mama's old silver cross had started to tarnish, no matter how much he polished it. Or how the wild irises that had bloomed around his property for decades had suddenly withered and died, their petals turning black as if burned by an invisible flame. He remembered the day, 6 months earlier, when he'd found that strange object half buried in the mud near his favorite fishing spot. It had looked like a piece of driftwood at first, twisted and dark with age, but when he'd reached down to pick it up, the surface had felt warm to the touch, almost feverish, and patterns had seemed to shift beneath its surface like oil on the water. He dropped it back into the mud, wiped his hands on his jeans, and tried to forget about it. And that night he dreamed of deep waters and deeper spaces between the stars. The dreams had continued, each one more vivid than the last. He'd see himself standing on his dock, but the water below would be different. Not the familiar murky brown of the bayou, but something darker, something that seemed to swallow light itself. In these dreams, shapes moved in the depths, their geometries all wrong, their movements following laws of physics that existed only in the spaces between reality. Mason had started drinking more heavily after that, hoping that the bourbon would keep the dreams at bay. It didn't. Instead, the alcohol seemed to thin the veil between what he thought he knew about the world and what was actually there, lurking just beyond the edge of human perception. He tried to leave once, about a week before that final night, packed a bag, loaded his truck, even made it halfway down his long driveway before the engine had died. When he'd popped the hood, he found the engine compartment filled with what looked like black moss, but it had moved when he touched it, coiling around his fingers like it was trying to pull him in. He'd slammed the door shut and walked back to his cabin, the moss vanishing from his hands like morning dew, but leaving behind a numbness that lasted for days. The thing in the water had been testing him, he realized now, learning his limits, his fears, his breaking points. It had probably been watching him for his whole life, watching everyone who lived along these waters, selecting its moments with the patience of something that measured time in geological epochs rather than human years. And sometimes in the weeks leading up to that final night, Mason would sit on his porch and try to piece together all the stories he heard growing up, tales of people who vanished in the swamp, of lights that danced above the water, of sounds that couldn't be explained. His grandfather had told him about the Cajun trapper who'd gone missing in 1947, leaving behind only a journal full of drawings that had been driven to the local priest to drink when he had seen them. The old-timer at Prejean's General would talk about the summer of '62, when a whole family disappeared from their boathouse, their belongings found arranged in perfect geometric patterns that made compass needles spin. All those stories, all those disappearances, and nobody had ever connected them. Or maybe they had, but those who figured it out joined the ranks of the missing before they could warn anyone else. The really terrifying thing Mason had realized in those final moments as the creature entered his home was that it hadn't chosen him because he was special. It had chosen him because he was there, because he was convenient, because he was alone. The thing in the water didn't care about human concerns like meaning or purpose. It was like a child pulling wings off of flies, curious, methodical, and utterly indifferent to the suffering it caused. As those red eyes drew closer, as reality began to peel away like old wallpaper revealing the void beneath, Mason's last coherent thought wasn't of escape or survival. Instead, he wondered about all the others who had faced this moment before him. Had they seen what he was about to see? Had they learned what he was about to learn? And most importantly, did any part of them still exist somewhere in the spaces between moments, between molecules, between the very fabric of reality itself? The answer, he discovered, was yes. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. Now, they found Mason's cabin 3 weeks later, after the mail carrier noticed his uncollected letters spilling out of the box at the end of his driveway. The local police conducted a thorough search, but found no signs of violence, no indication of where the old man had gone. His boat was still tied to the dock. His truck sat in the gravel driveway. Even his wallet and keys remained on the kitchen counter, next to a radio that had somehow melted into a twisted lump of plastic and metal. The only unusual thing they found was a pattern burned into the kitchen floor, a complex spiral of symbols that made the investigating officer's eyes water when they looked at it for too long. The police photographer's camera shorted out when he tried to document it, and everyone who attempted to sketch the pattern found themselves drawing something different. And within a month, the search was called off. Mason became another entry in a long list of people who had vanished in the Louisiana swamps over the years. The locals added his story to their collection of cautionary tales, warnings whispering over beers about things that lived in the dark waters. But on quiet nights, when the moon hangs low and the air grows thick with humidity, some say they could still hear music coming from Mason's cabin. Not music made by human hands, but something older, something that sounds like static given voice, calling out to anyone willing to listen. And in the water around the dock, 2 red lights can sometimes be seen, watching, waiting for the next person who stays too long in the bayou after dark. The locals know better now. When night falls, they hurry home and lock their doors. They know that something crawled out of the depths of the swamp, something that wore Mason Thibodeau's curiosity like a lure, drawing him in until it was too late. They know it's still out there, learning and adapting, hungry for more stories to add to its collection. And sometimes, on the darkest of nights, when the cicadas fall silent and the gators sink beneath the surface, those who live near Mason's old place swear they can hear his voice on the wind. Not screaming or crying, but laughing, a sound of pure joy mixed with absolute terror, as if he's finally understood some cosmic joke that drove him mad in the knowing. The swamp keeps its secrets, they say, but sometimes, if you listen closely enough, those secrets whisper back. Just don't whisper back to them. Mason did, and now he's part of the darkness that calls out on moonless nights, parts of the hunger that grows stronger with each passing year. His story lives on in the depths of the bayou, in the spaces between the cypress roots, in the shadows that move when no wind blows. And that thing with the red eyes, well, it's still watching. It's still waiting. It's still hungry for new stories to add to its collection. It's waiting for someone else who thinks they know the swamp well enough to stay out after dark. Someone else who thinks the old stories are just stories. Someone else who will look into those red lights and see something beautiful in their glow, right up until the moment they understand what they're really seeing. And by then, of course, it's always too late.